wind howled across the empty plains like a hungry wolf, clawing at the old wooden boards of Dry Creek Ranch. The night was wild, with sheets of rain slashing through the darkness, lightning cracking open the sky, and the smell of dust and thunder mixed into the air like something ancient and untamed. Inside the barn, John Mercer sat alone on a stool, his head bowed, his rough hands resting on his knees. He was a man of few words, a rancher who lived miles from the nearest town, a man carved by silence and solitude. The land was his companion, the cattle his company, and the wind his only song. Since his wife Emily passed away 2 winters ago, he hadn't spoken more than a few words to anyone. The people in town called him the Silent Rancher. He didn't care. Silence was safer than words. It didn't break your heart. Outside, thunder rolled like the earth itself was moaning, and the rain fell harder, hammering on the tin roof. John got up to close the barn doors, tightening his coat around his shoulders. He moved with that slow, deliberate grace that only men who work with the land understand. Half power, half patience. But as he reached the doors, he froze. Through the curtain of rain, a small shadow moved, something fragile stumbling toward the barn. It wasn't an animal. It was a girl. She was drenched, her hair plastered to her face, her dress torn at the hem, her shoes filled with mud. She looked like she'd been walking for miles. John stood still, watching her as she reached the gate, pushed it open with trembling hands, and stumbled inside. For a moment, she just stood there, gasping for breath, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. She couldn't have been more than 17. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Please. Can I slip under your coat? It's so cold." The words hit John like a bolt of lightning. For a man who hadn't spoken to anyone in months, who had built walls of silence around his soul, the sound of that trembling young voice pierced straight through. He didn't move, didn't answer, just stared at her as rainwater dripped from her chin onto the dirt floor. For a second, she thought he might yell or worse, turn her away, but he didn't. He just stood there, frozen in shock, trying to make sense of what was happening. Slowly, he took a step forward, his boots crunching on the straw. "What are you doing out here?" he asked finally, his voice low and rough, like the earth itself had forgotten how to speak. The girl blinked through the rain, clutching her arms around her shivering body. I was running," she said, "from them." Her voice cracked on the last word, and John felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. Pity. "Who's them?" he asked. She shook her head, backing up a step. "Please, I can't go back there." "I'll do anything. I just need to get warm." Her words tumbled out in panic, her eyes glistening in the dim light. John hesitated, torn between caution and compassion. He'd lived long enough to know that trouble came in many forms, and sometimes it came wearing innocent eyes. But something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the desperation in her voice, or the way her hands trembled as she tried to wring the water from her sleeves. With a quiet sigh, he took off his heavy coat and stepped closer. "Here," he said, holding it out. She stared at it, then at him, uncertain. "Go on," he murmured. "You'll freeze if you don't." Slowly, she slipped under the coat, her small frame nearly disappearing inside it. The fabric swallowed her, and she closed her eyes, exhaling a shaky breath as warmth finally touched her skin. John looked at her, really looked at her, and noticed how young she was, how her face was pale and frightened. But beneath it all, there was something else. Determination. "You got a name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Clara," she said finally, her voice trembling. "Clara Evans." "Where are you from, Clara Evans?" She looked down at the floor. "North Ridge." John frowned. "That's 20 miles from here. You walk all that way?" She nodded. Since last night. And this storm?" Her silence was answer enough. He motioned toward the corner where an old blanket lay over a hay bale. "Sit down before you fall down." She obeyed without a word, sinking onto the bale, pulling his coat tight around her shoulders. For a few minutes, the only sound was the rain, hammering the roof and the wind moaning through the cracks. John went to the stove in the corner, lit a match, and got a small fire going in the rusted barrel he used for warmth. The flames licked the darkness, casting golden light across the barn. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded weakly. He handed her a piece of bread from the shelf. She took it with trembling hands, whispering, "Thank you." He sat down across from her, watching her eat. There was something fragile about her, but also something fierce, like a small bird that had survived a storm, but still had flight left in its wings. When she finished, she looked up. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said softly. "I just didn't know where else to go. They were following me." "Who?" John asked again, his brow furrowed. She swallowed. "Men from town. My uncle sold me to them. Said they'd find me a job, but they didn't want work from me." Her voice broke, and she looked away, her fingers clutching the coat tighter. John felt anger rise in his chest, slow and burning. He'd seen the worst of men before, seen what greed and cruelty could do, but hearing it from a trembling girl sitting in his barn brought it home like a knife twist. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Ain't no one getting to you tonight." She looked up at him, eyes glistening. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer right away. "Because someone once helped me," he said finally. "A long time ago. The storm raged outside, but inside the barn, there was a fragile peace. Two souls who had both lost too much, sitting together in silence. As the fire crackled, Clara began to relax, her breathing slowing." John leaned back, staring into the flames. The warmth brought back memories. Emily laughing by the stove, her hands covered in flour, her hair glowing in the sunlight. He closed his eyes for a moment. The ache was still there, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel empty. Hours passed. The storm softened to a drizzle. Clara had fallen asleep, curled up in the corner, his coat wrapped around her like a cocoon. John stood quietly watching her, then walked to the door and looked out at the gray horizon. Something told him this girl's arrival was not a coincidence. Trouble would come looking, and he, the man who had chosen silence over life, would have to speak again, this time for her. He turned back, his eyes steady, his heart heavy but alive. The wind whispered through the cracks, carrying her voice in his mind. "Sir, can I slip under your coat?" It was more than a plea for warmth. It was a spark that might just thaw the ice that had gripped his soul for years. He didn't know it yet, but this storm had brought him more than rain. It had brought him redemption.